these things will happen. This is the big answer to your question. And that's the only thing I fight over. I do not fight over when the years begin and when the years end, or is there a gap between the years, or this or that, or how do you divide the weeks, or is there 2 anointed ones or one? None of that troubles me. None of that bothers me in the least. None of that threatens the meaning of this passage whatsoever. The hill that I'm going to die on, so to say, where I'll stake out the claim because it is absolute and definite, is that these things had to happen before the destruction of the second temple. Who was the anointed one that was cut off at that time? Who was the one that was responsible for bringing an atoning for wickedness, etc., etc.? Simple to me. All the other things, listen to me, you can get into endless discussion. Massive books have been written about this. Perhaps you'll come to a conclusion that says, no, we divide the weeks just the way it is in this Christian translation, and it begins on this day, we can trace it. It's fine. Go for it. Have at it, as they say. Enjoy yourself. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm simply saying 2 things. Number 1, in this context, with all that we want to cover, we're not going to fight that battle. Number 2, it's a battle we don't need to fight, because all we need to do is demonstrate, as we saw yesterday, that the Messiah had to come and bring redemption and initiate the Messianic age before the second temple was destroyed. That's all you have to demonstrate, and this is one of the texts, which is the part of the threefold cord that indicates that. Again, at the end of the day, we'll have some time for questions if you'd like to ask them, but this is what we'll lay out here. You can also read the material as we lay it out in Volume 3. So as I respond here to this argument, Daniel 9:24-27 speaks of 2 anointed ones. I say it is possible that the text does speak of 2 anointed ones. The first in 9:25 and the second in 9:26. So first in one setting and the second over 400 years later. This depends on how the 70 weeks are divided, but this presents no problem at all, since it is clear that if there are 2 anointed ones, the second anointed one is the Messiah, and the Messianic era had to be inaugurated before the second temple was destroyed, thus pointing decisively to Jesus as the key figure of whom the text speaks. Now, the interesting thing about this passage is that Rashi, the foremost biblical and Talmudic commentator, lived from 1040 to 1105. We reference him in the glossary of each of these volumes. When he interprets this verse, he talks about things happening within the generations surrounding the time of Yeshua, okay? Because, of course, you end up with the destruction of the temple, which is 40 years after Messiah's death, resurrection. So we all know the general time frame where it ends. But then he just goes on he jumps over to the Messianic age. It's a peculiar thing. I'm not a Rashi scholar, but I study the writings of Rashi scholars, and I've discussed this with other rabbis. It's kind of a strange jump from this text here, and boop, and in the days of the Messiah. I think, well, where'd that come? He's talking about the future, way future still, even from his own day. How could it be? There's the famous story of Rachmiel Friedland, who grew up as an ultra-Orthodox Jew in Poland, and great suffering survived the Holocaust, went into a meeting that was Jewish believers in Jesus. He went to the meeting, and he heard them praying, and as I recall the testimony, he just laughed to himself because they were praying in Yiddish. They were just speaking to God in their own familiar language, and for him that was a strange thing, because he was just used to saying the prayers of the rabbis, many of which are beautiful, wonderful prayers, but that's how you pray. Almost all of your prayers, you're reciting prayers that have been written in a book for the community of Israel to pray together, etc. So that was kind of comical of him to hear somebody talking to God like that. But when he went and studied out Daniel 9:24-27, one of the things that convinced him that the rabbinic interpretation was wrong was when he read Rashi's interpretation. He saw it couldn't possibly be right. Couldn't possibly be right. This is a brilliant, insightful Rashi. He saw it couldn't be right. And then when he heard the Messianic interpretation referring to Yeshua, there it was. There it was. Let's just look at a couple more disputed texts. Zechariah 12:10. Zechariah 12:10. Now remember, we gave a positive presentation yesterday of the Messiahship of Yeshua. And we laid it out, and then we reiterated why it has to be Jesus. Now we're looking not to so much build faith and give vision as much as to answer objections, deal with issues. In other words, it's kind of like you have a witness on the stand who testifies, and he lays out everything very clearly. Now someone's going to come and challenge every statement he made and cross-examine him. So he's going to be on the defensive, but if he's got the truth, his testimony is going to stand, okay? You could get a rabbi, get up here and talk about the oral law and Jewish tradition and why it's the right way and why it's what God gave, and give a powerful presentation. And then I could give 100 objections to it, and now he's going to have to try to, okay, can we respond to these and these and these and these? So that's all I'm doing now is responding to objections. That's why we started with, here's a positive presentation. Let's lay this out. Now let's see, was Matthew making things up? Were the Christian translators making things up? Were people yanking things out of any possible context? Or do we have good, solid answers? So Zechariah 12:10. Is this messianic? Does it refer to Yeshua? The chapter is definitely an end-time chapter. It hasn't happened yet with all nations coming up against Jerusalem and God fighting for his people. Then verse 10, and I'll pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. V'hibitu Eliah t'asher dekaru. They'll look to me, the one they've pierced, v'safdu alav, and they'll mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. On that day the weeping in Jerusalem will be great. And it goes on to the breakdown of the depth of weeping and wailing. In chapter 13, verse 1, on that day a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. So this, as I read it, is a very powerful picture of the Jewish people, especially the religious, at the end of this age, recognizing the Messiah as their pierced one and looking to him with great agony of heart, grieving, mourning, deep repentance, as a result of which a fountain is opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. The New Testament quotes this, but it quotes it in a past context. It quotes it in John 19 about the crucifixion of Jesus. But it quotes it in a past context very simply because in order for them to look in the future on the one that's pierced, he had to be pierced. So that's all John's saying is to fulfill this, he's pierced. So they can look on the one that's pierced, and this will one day happen in the future. There's an interesting discussion in the Talmud about this passage. One view is that it's referring to the evil inclination, the evil desires that we battle, the evil inclination. And the Jewish people are looking to God on that day when they stand before him, mourning and weeping because they had such trouble with the evil inclination. Another interpretation, though, says that this is the Messiah, son of Joseph. There are some Jewish people to this day that believe in two Messiahs, the Messiah, son of Joseph, and the Messiah, son of David. They say the Messiah, son of Joseph, will be raised up in the end of days, and he will fight the wars of the Lord, but will ultimately be killed in battle. Not dying primarily in a vicarious